The bar hummed with a mix of alien voices, deep, grumbling, and melodic. Each sound was strange, each face a study in colors and shapes. Patrons clustered around tables and the long, dented counter, each absorbed in their own stories and drinks. Behind the counter moved a tall, lean figure, the bartender. Quiet and steady, he served drinks, wiped spills, and slipped by without drawing much attention. A human among aliens, just another fixture in the bar. Every day, he worked in silence, answering questions with short nods or a tilt of his head. His movements were smooth, efficient, and always precise. He could pull up a drink order, dodge a flailing arm, and keep the bar spotless without missing a beat. Patrons whispered that he seemed almost unnatural in his calm. But nobody paid him much mind. He was, after all, just a bartender, a human who'd found his way to the edge of the galaxy to do simple work. Nothing about him seemed unusual, except for perhaps the thin scars that crossed his hands and the way his eyes flickered, always noticing every detail around him. Around the bar, alien guards stationed themselves in pairs, big and heavily armed, their rough voices and heavy steps announcing their presence. They were a common sight in this outpost. They came to drink off-duty or stand watch when assigned, though none of them ever bothered to look twice at the bartender. To them, he was another human, plain and uninteresting, no different from any other. They laughed loudly, their voices booming over the bar noise, drinking and ignoring the man who quietly poured their refills. The bartender never reacted to their laughter or their occasional jokes at his expense. Sometimes they mocked the quiet way he worked or his simple clothes. But he never showed a trace of anger or discomfort. He simply kept on with his work, sliding drinks across the bar, cleaning up, and keeping the shelves stocked. He was an ordinary presence, part of the scenery, blending in perfectly, almost like a ghost. Yet, every so often, a patron would glance at him with a flicker of curiosity. Some could feel there was something unusual about him, a quiet intensity that set him apart from other humans they met. But as quickly as they noticed it, they brushed it off, distracted by the noise and the atmosphere. After all, why would a lone bartender on a distant outpost be anything more than he appeared? He moved down the line of drinks, filling each glass, wiping down the counter, never faltering, never distracted. His hands, scarred but steady, worked with an almost unnatural smoothness. He had a way of anticipating the patron's needs, setting a drink down just as they emptied their glass or clearing a space as soon as it was vacated. No one knew his name, and he offered none. For the regulars, he was simply the bartender. Nothing more. Nothing less. As he worked, his gaze occasionally shifted to the entrance, not out of concern or interest, but with a calm, observing quality. His eyes, sharp and dark, watched everything. He saw the guards as they came in, their loud laughter and stomping boots filling the space. He saw the aliens laughing and bickering, the deals whispered in hushed voices. He saw every hand that moved toward a pocket, every glance exchanged in secret. Nothing seemed to escape his attention, though he remained an unobtrusive part of the bar's background. Sometimes, when a quiet moment settled, he'd pause and let his gaze drift, his expression unreadable, as if his mind was miles away. But as quickly as it came, the moment would pass, and he'd return to his work. Patrons noticed this faraway look only occasionally, and it was forgotten almost as quickly as it appeared. He gave no reason to think of him as anything but an efficient bartender, doing his job and keeping to himself. The guards, loud and brash, occasionally tossed him a glance, but it was usually dismissive. A human? Harmless. Weak. They never suspected anything different. To them, he was only worth their time when they needed another drink. Otherwise, he didn't register in their world. They went about their business, ignoring the quiet figure who refilled their glasses and moved past them like a shadow. But in those quiet moments when he paused, his eyes held a depth, a flicker of something that hinted at a different life, a distant memory buried under layers of calm. If anyone had looked closely enough, they might have noticed the hint of readiness in his stance, or the way his gaze seemed to see through things. But no one did. And that was just the way he wanted it. The bar was alive with whispers. Alien patrons spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories of strange sightings, wild adventures, and legendary figures. It wasn't unusual for stories to circulate here, especially ones that seemed to grow in detail with every retelling. This time, though, a tale was spreading that captured everyone's attention, the story of a legendary human warrior. Rumors drifted like smoke, finding their way to every corner, filling the gaps between laughter and clinking glasses. The whispers described a figure from years past, a human warrior who had made his name on distant battlefields, leaving a trail of fear and respect across the galaxies. This warrior, it was said, moved like a ghost and fought with unmatched precision, feared by even the toughest alien soldiers. Some described him as a phantom, slipping into battles unseen, leaving devastation in his wake before disappearing without a trace. Others claimed he had fought in some of the bloodiest conflicts, always emerging victorious, always a step ahead of his enemies. The tales grew darker, painting him as a figure both respected and feared, one who had vanished as mysteriously as he'd arrived on the scene. As the story was passed along, descriptions grew more elaborate. His enemies, they said, had no chance once they were in his sights. He didn't need armor, and he didn't need advanced weapons. His skill alone was his greatest weapon. Some claimed he could take down even the strongest aliens with his bare hands, his movements so swift that his opponents didn't realize what had happened until it was over. They said his reputation alone could stop a fight before it began. No one wanted to face a warrior like him. Those who did had met swift and brutal ends. At the bar counter, the bartender continued his work without pause, his expression unchanging as he listened. The tales filled the room, drawing gasps and murmurs of awe, but he only nodded as he poured drinks, his face betraying nothing. He seemed almost detached, a fixture in the background, listening without reacting. Yet if one looked closer, there was a quiet understanding in his eyes, a faint flicker of recognition that passed as quickly as it appeared. It was as if he knew these stories, as if he'd seen the battles, though he remained silent. The details grew with each retelling, each patron adding their own embellishments. Some described the warrior's supposed armor, dark, sleek, and almost unbreakable. Others painted a picture of his fighting style, claiming he moved like a shadow, his actions smooth and deadly, a force that couldn't be contained. The stories hinted that this warrior was more than human, his abilities surpassing the limits of ordinary men. No one knew what had happened to him. Some said he'd been captured, others believed he'd simply disappeared, vanishing from the universe like a whisper on the wind. One of the alien patrons, a large, burly creature with scales covering his skin, leaned in close, his voice low and reverent. "I heard he once took down an entire squadron single-handedly," he murmured, his eyes wide. "Not a single weapon on him, just his bare hands. They say he didn't even break a sweat." Others nodded, each adding their own details, their voices a mix of fear and admiration. Through it all, the bartender worked in silence, his hands steady, his movements practiced. He listened to the tales as though he were hearing them for the first time, yet his eyes held an awareness, a distant look that seemed to understand more than he let on. No one paid much attention to him, caught up in the excitement of the story. To them, he was just another human, another unremarkable face in a galaxy full of unique creatures. Some patrons joked that such a warrior could be anywhere, hiding in plain sight, even among the unassuming faces of the outpost. Laughter followed the idea, as absurd as it sounded. After all, a legend like that wouldn't waste his time in a bar, would he? The warrior they spoke of belonged on the battlefield, not serving drinks to aliens at a rundown outpost. The bartender continued his work, his expression unchanged, his focus unwavering, blending into the background as the story continued around him. The guards, who usually ignored the idle chatter, listened with interest this time. They laughed at the idea of a human warrior, finding it amusing that any human could inspire such fear. They exchanged grins, dismissing the tale as nothing more than exaggerated legend. Humans, in their eyes, were weak and fragile, hardly worth the hype. The idea of one being a formidable fighter was nothing but a joke. The bartender, quiet as always, continued his work, his face impassive, as if he hadn't heard a word. Yet, even as the laughter died down, the story lingered. The idea that a human warrior could be hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment, seemed to stick with some of the patrons. They cast glances around, half jokingly, but with a hint of curiosity, wondering if the stories held any truth. The bartender, still calm and composed, gave them no reason to suspect him, no indication that he was anything more than he seemed. He remained an enigma, a figure so ordinary that he was easy to overlook. As the whispers faded, the bartender's expression remained unchanged. His work continued as if nothing had happened, his presence quiet and unassuming. Yet there was something in his eyes, a calmness, a depth that suggested he understood the tales more than anyone realized. But in this moment, he was simply the bartender, a human among aliens, listening as the tales faded into the background, lost in the noise of the outpost bar. A heavy silence settled over the bar as the doors swung open, and a new group entered. The regular noise dropped, and all eyes turned toward the figures stepping inside. The newcomers were not the usual patrons. They were larger, rougher, and carried themselves with an air of threat. Their appearance, a mix of scars and fierce eyes, made it clear they were trouble. The regular patrons shrank back slightly, wary but curious, trying to gauge the situation. These strangers weren't here for a drink or casual conversation. The bartender noticed immediately but didn't stop working. He observed them, measuring the new tension in the room without reacting. He continued to clean a glass, his movements steady and unhurried. The intruders scanned the bar, eyes sharp, taking in the guards and the other patrons. There was an edge to their gazes, an unspoken challenge that seemed to hang heavy in the air. The guards tensed but held back, unsure of the newcomer's intentions yet unwilling to start trouble outright. A low, dangerous laugh came from one of the intruders, a massive creature with dark scales and piercing yellow eyes. He sauntered forward, brushing past tables as though the patrons didn't exist. His focus was sharp, almost predatory, as he seemed to size up everyone in the room. Another of his group, a smaller but equally fierce alien with jagged, dark ridges down its back, leaned close to a trembling patron, giving a smirk that showed rows of sharp teeth. The message was clear: these weren't visitors to be crossed. The regular patrons shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, hoping to avoid attention. The guards, though meant to keep peace, exchanged uneasy looks. These newcomers didn't just seem like trouble, they were trouble. But the guards were cautious. They'd dealt with many a rowdy alien before, but something about these intruders gave them pause. For now, they held back, watching and waiting, unsure if this was a challenge they were prepared to meet. The largest of the intruders turned his gaze toward the bartender, sizing him up for a moment. Then, with a sneer, he dismissed him, focusing instead on the guards. He made a point of ignoring the bartender entirely, as though he was barely worth noticing. The bartender continued his work, calm and collected, his face as expressionless as ever. He watched without appearing to watch, taking in every detail. But he showed no reaction, no sign of concern. The leader of the group gave a low growl, speaking to his companions. "Where is he, then?" he muttered, loud enough for a few patrons nearby to hear. His voice was laced with impatience and menace, a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. His companions laughed quietly, a dangerous sound that sent a ripple of fear through the crowd. They weren't just here to cause a scene, they were searching for someone. One of the guards, finally unable to keep silent, stepped forward. "What do you want here?" he demanded, trying to sound authoritative. But his voice wavered slightly, betraying his uncertainty. The lead intruder looked him over, unimpressed. He sneered, dismissing the guard with a casual flick of his wrist. "Not you," he replied, voice dripping with disdain. "We're looking for a human. A warrior, they say." His words were like a challenge, hanging heavily in the air. Everyone in the room felt the weight of it. A murmur spread through the crowd. A human warrior? The idea seemed absurd, almost laughable. Humans were generally seen as weaker, hardly capable of standing up to the more formidable aliens that filled the galaxy. But these intruders clearly believed what they'd heard. They didn't come looking for an ordinary human. They were hunting a legend, someone rumored to be as deadly as he was elusive. The tension in the room climbed. The patrons, intrigued but fearful, exchanged nervous glances. The guards tried to maintain control, but they were clearly outmatched, their authority fading as the newcomers ignored them. The bartender remained in the background, watching it all unfold. He showed no outward reaction, but his eyes were sharp, focused. His hands continued to move in steady motions, cleaning and preparing as if the intrusion were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. One of the intruders grabbed a nearby chair, slamming it onto the floor with a loud crash. The sound echoed, and a few patrons flinched. The leader leaned in close to a random alien at the bar, voice low and menacing. "We know he's here somewhere," he said, his tone dripping with threat. "So someone better start talking." His companions circled the bar, eyes narrowed, clearly ready for a fight. No one spoke, but the fear was palpable, filling every corner of the room. Another guard stepped forward, this one braver, or more reckless, than the rest. "You're not welcome here," he said firmly, though his voice lacked true conviction. The lead intruder snorted, clearly unimpressed. "And what are you going to do about it?" he sneered, his voice mocking. The guard hesitated, and in that moment of doubt, the intruder let out a harsh laugh, pushing the guard aside with casual force. The guard stumbled but managed to stay upright, humiliated but too intimidated to retaliate. The bartender continued working, his face calm, his posture relaxed. He didn't flinch or pause, simply blending into the background as he had always done. His expression remained neutral, though his eyes stayed on the intruders, tracking their every movement with a quiet intensity. He looked as though he was merely an observer, uninvolved and unaffected by the rising danger in the room. The intruders, growing impatient, started roughing up the patrons, pushing and prodding, their voices loud and taunting. They wanted answers, and they were willing to tear the place apart to get them. Chairs were overturned, glasses shattered, and tension hung thick in the air. The guards, outmatched and uncertain, held back, reluctant to engage with aliens so clearly superior in strength and aggression. Through it all, the bartender worked in silence, moving as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. He refilled glasses, wiped down the counter, and moved past the intruders without drawing attention. It was as if he existed on a different plane, unaffected by the chaos unfolding around him. The patrons, fearful and confused, glanced his way occasionally, wondering how he could remain so calm. The lead intruder's patience finally wore thin. "Enough," he barked, slamming his fist down on a table, sending a jolt through the room. "We're not leaving without him." His voice was a final warning, a threat that left no doubt he was willing to use force. He scanned the bar, eyes narrowing, daring anyone to speak. But no one moved. The patrons, the guards, all fell silent, waiting, unsure of what would happen next. The bartender continued his work, his hands steady, his face unreadable. He seemed almost out of place, untouched by the tension filling the room. A sudden shift filled the room. The lead intruder, irritated by the silence, let out a low, menacing growl and turned his gaze back to the bartender. There was a pause, a barely perceptible stillness, and then he moved forward, his intentions clear. He didn't see a threat, just a quiet human who seemed entirely ordinary. Reaching the bar, he sneered, leaning forward with a mocking expression as he attempted to grab the bartender's arm, his movements rough and forceful. Without warning, the bartender shifted, his hand snapping out with precision. The intruder's grip was instantly broken, and before anyone could react, the bartender twisted the intruder's arm, forcing him down with swift, unyielding pressure. A stunned silence filled the room as the powerful alien found himself immobilized, his expression one of utter disbelief. It was over in an instant, the bartender's movements efficient, sharp, almost clinical. For the first time, the patrons realized that this quiet figure wasn't as ordinary as he appeared. The room seemed to hold its breath as the bartender stepped back, his gaze calm, almost indifferent, as if the entire incident had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But there was something new in his stance, a subtle shift that spoke volumes. His posture was different now, no longer that of a simple worker but of someone in complete control, someone used to situations far more dangerous than a rowdy bar. He didn't look around or acknowledge the stares, he simply continued as if nothing had happened. The remaining intruders exchanged uneasy glances, thrown off by the sudden change in their leader's position. They hadn't expected resistance, especially not from the one person they'd dismissed entirely. The bartender hadn't said a word, hadn't made a single threat, yet his actions were louder than any words. The guards, stunned, took a step back, no longer sure if they should intervene or let things unfold. The bartender's calm, quiet control over the situation left everyone frozen. One of the intruders, unwilling to be outdone, snarled and launched forward, fists ready to strike. The bartender moved faster than anyone could track, sidestepping the attack with fluid grace, a movement so swift it left his opponent stumbling. In a single, efficient motion, he delivered a strike that dropped the attacker without a sound. The patrons watched, wide-eyed, as another intruder went down. This was no ordinary bar worker. His skill, his precision, they were unmistakable. It was like watching a master craftsman at work, each movement calculated and executed with flawless timing. The tension shifted into something new, a mix of awe and disbelief. This man they'd seen every day, blending into the background, was suddenly an unstoppable force. The patrons who had once ignored him, who had laughed at his quiet demeanor, now felt a thrill of fear and respect. There was a quiet power here that couldn't be denied. One by one, the intruders faltered, realizing they were up against something they hadn't anticipated. It was like a predator realizing too late that it had chosen the wrong prey. The guards, who had stood by watching, exchanged glances, unsure of their own authority in this moment. For all their strength and weapons, they understood that they were outmatched by this unassuming human who needed neither armor nor weapons to dominate. His movements, each precise and unhesitating, made it clear that he was no stranger to combat. Every action spoke of a life spent honing his skills, of battles fought and won in places far from this bar. Another intruder tried to circle him, attempting to catch him off guard. But the bartender's eyes were sharp, tracking every movement with a calm that bordered on eerie. He turned, sidestepping the attack with a grace that seemed almost unnatural, delivering a blow that sent the attacker to the floor. There was no anger in his actions, no visible emotion. He fought with an efficiency that left no room for error, his face as unreadable as ever, his movements precise and lethal. Now, the intruders were visibly shaken, their confidence shattered. They had come looking for a legend, and it was becoming clear they had found exactly what they were seeking. The patrons watched, their respect for the bartender growing with each fallen intruder. He was no longer just a quiet figure behind the counter. He was something far more dangerous, something they hadn't seen coming. The guards, once dismissive, now held a newfound respect, silently acknowledging that they were in the presence of someone far beyond their understanding. The leader of the intruders, struggling to regain his footing, looked up, his expression one of rage and disbelief. This was not how things were supposed to go. He'd expected an easy victory, a display of strength. Instead, he was faced with a man whose skill left no doubt that he was exactly the legend the whispers had spoken of. But even now, the bartender showed no sign of triumph or pride. He moved with the same calm, unyielding precision, dispatching his opponents with minimal effort, as if it were just another part of his daily routine. As the last of the intruders fell, the bartender stood there, unruffled, his gaze sweeping over the room with quiet finality. There was no grand declaration, no moment of celebration. He simply returned to his position behind the bar, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever, his presence as quiet as it had been before. The patrons and guards, still in shock, exchanged looks of disbelief. They had seen something extraordinary, something they would remember for years to come. In that moment, the bar returned to its previous state of calm, though it was a fragile calm, marked by the new understanding of who this man truly was. The bartender resumed his work as though nothing had happened, slipping back into his routine with a practiced ease. There was no hint of arrogance, no acknowledgement of what he had done. He simply moved on, his focus returning to his tasks, leaving behind a room full of stunned onlookers. For the patrons, the guards, and even the fallen intruders, the realization was slow but powerful. This man they'd overlooked, the quiet human who'd poured their drinks without a word, was indeed the figure of legend they'd spoken of. His reputation hadn't been exaggerated, it had been, if anything, understated. And as he continued his work, the silence lingered, filled with awe and a newfound respect that none dared to speak aloud. The bartender, still calm and composed, was once again just a figure behind the counter, but now, no one in the room would ever see him as ordinary again. The room was quiet, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The patrons, once wrapped in their own stories and laughter, now sat in stunned silence, still processing the swift, undeniable power they had just witnessed. The guards, usually the loudest and most confident, now avoided the bartender's gaze, humbled by his effortless skill. Some patrons exchanged glances, unsure if they should acknowledge him or simply pretend nothing had happened. There was a tension, a quiet awe, as everyone tried to understand the man they thought they knew. Without a word, the bartender resumed his routine. He picked up a glass, cleaned it, set it back down, and moved to the next, as though this moment was no different from any other day. His movements were as precise and unhurried as ever, but now each action seemed to carry a deeper weight. Patrons noticed the scars on his hands with new eyes, no longer seeing them as random marks but as a quiet testament to a life no one had imagined. The fallen intruders, still groaning in defeat, were being carried out, their arrogance shattered. They avoided the bartender's gaze, no longer seeing him as a mere human but as something far beyond their understanding. The guards, though hesitant, helped them to the exit, unwilling to make eye contact with the one man in the room who demonstrated a power none of them could rival. As they moved, their expressions revealed a mixture of respect and fear, an unspoken acknowledgement that they'd been wrong about him all along. The patrons, uncertain but emboldened by curiosity, began to whisper. The once dismissive tales of the legendary human warrior were now stories with a face, a reality that had unfolded right before their eyes. Every detail of his skill, his precision, his silence, lingered in the minds of everyone in the room. A few patrons, braver than the rest, gave him a nod of respect, though he did not return their gestures. He simply continued with his work, unperturbed and unchanged. One of the guards, gathering the courage to speak, approached the bar and cleared his throat, but he found himself at a loss for words. The bartender paused, glanced at him, and waited, his face neutral, giving nothing away. Whatever words the guard had intended were quickly swallowed, and he simply stepped back, overwhelmed by the quiet strength emanating from the man he'd once dismissed as ordinary. The bartender gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement, before turning back to his tasks, his presence as calm as ever. Despite the normal rhythm of the bar returning, the atmosphere had shifted. Patrons no longer saw the bartender as an invisible figure behind the counter but as someone whose presence held a mystery they couldn't ignore. Those who had scoffed at the legends, those who had dismissed the stories, now found themselves drawn to him, not out of obligation but out of awe. They watched him with a mixture of fascination and reverence, trying to reconcile the quiet man with the legendary figure they had spoken of only hours before. As the last of the intruders were removed from the bar, the patrons breathed a collective sigh of relief, though the tension remained. They knew they'd witnessed something rare, something they would likely never see again. Some murmured among themselves, wondering where he had come from, what battles he'd fought, and why he was here, in such a remote place. But none dared to ask him directly. The bartender had made his intentions clear through his silence. He was not here to share stories or satisfy their curiosity. He was here to work, nothing more. For a moment, one of the younger patrons, full of wonder and admiration, leaned forward, eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you the warrior they talked about?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The bartender met his gaze, holding it for a beat longer than usual, but he didn't answer. He simply turned back to his work, leaving the question hanging in the air, unanswered yet somehow complete. His silence was enough. It was his answer, a quiet reminder that he was more than they could understand. The bar began to settle back into its usual rhythm, though the change in the atmosphere lingered. The patrons returned to their conversations, but their words were softer, their tones more subdued. They glanced at the bartender now and then, seeing him in a new light, but no one interrupted his work. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that there was a story in his silence, a history that he chose to keep hidden. As the hours passed, a new respect grew for the quiet man behind the counter. They realized that he did not seek recognition or admiration. His skill, his calm, his strength, all were things he carried without fanfare or expectation. He had not needed an audience, nor did he need anyone's approval. He was simply there, as he always had been, offering no more than was asked, giving only what was needed. The patrons understood, now more than ever, that his silence was not emptiness but a choice. Gradually, the night deepened, and the patrons began to leave, each casting one last look at the bartender as they passed. Some gave him a nod, a silent acknowledgement of his strength. Others avoided his gaze, still processing what they had witnessed. But all left with a newfound understanding, a sense that they had glimpsed a part of something vast and profound, something that was not meant to be understood fully. The bartender watched them go, his expression unchanged, his gaze steady. When the bar was finally empty, he wiped down the counter, setting everything back in place with his usual precision. The quiet of the empty bar was almost peaceful, a familiar calm that settled over him. He paused for a moment, looking out at the now empty tables, and then returned to his duties, his movements steady, his focus undisturbed. Outside, whispers would spread, tales of the quiet bartender who was far more than he seemed. The patrons would carry the story, retelling it in their own ways, each adding their own details, their own sense of wonder. He knew his legend would grow, becoming something larger than life, a tale that would find its way to other distant places. But he had no interest in the stories. For him, the bar was simply his chosen place, a quiet spot in a noisy universe where he could work in peace. As the night deepened, he finished his tasks, putting everything in its place. The bar, once filled with whispers and tension, was now silent. And as he looked around one last time, he felt no need for acknowledgement or fame. He was simply a bartender, a quiet presence in a galaxy that would remember him in ways he neither sought nor desired. With one last glance, he stepped away from the counter, disappearing into the quiet, leaving behind only an empty bar and a story that would live on in the minds of those who had been there to witness it.